Welcome back. My name is Julian Frazier, and I'm going to be your fitness psychologist. This is part 3 of a 3-part series on self-actualization through stress management. This is the final part. If you've made it here, congratulations. If you haven't watched part 1 or part 2, that's perfectly fine. You're still going to be able to get something out of today. But all of the nitty-gritty details are in part 1 and part 2, respectively. So we're going to try to wrap things up. And if something seems confusing or isn't discussed in a lot of detail here, it likely exists somewhere in part 1 or part 2. So happy that we're able to round out this long series. I think when I was originally outlining this idea, it looked like it was going to be multiple hours. I think this is going to boil out to like 2.5-ish, maybe, between the 3 parts. I know it's a long time, but I hope that for some of you who can bear with long presentations, that this has been helpful in some ways. So let's actually round out this conversation around how stress management is essential if we're going to achieve something akin to self-actualization. Okay, so what have we learned so far? How do we summarize part 1 and part 2? Well, first thing that we really wanted to point out is that stress comes in different flavors, different forms. Some stress is bad. We call that distress, right? You're kind of used to distress. In fact, when you're usually talking about being stressed out, overworked, underpaid, those sorts of things, we're usually experiencing distress. But there's also a form of stress which is good. That's our friend eustress, right? That is the form of stress which is necessary to facilitate growth, development, focus, engagement, right? I want to be just the right amount of stressed out. And we talked about that Goldilocks zone, that too much stress is overwhelm, too little stress is underwhelm, and just right in the middle is what we think of when we think of eustress. Right. We learned that there's some behavioral and psychological strategies that we can use to maximize eustress, right? We can use some activation skills if we need to bring our energy, our stress arousal up a little bit from underwhelm into that Goldilocks zone. And if we're too high, we're too overwhelmed, we can use some coping mechanisms that are like relaxation based to bring the energies down a little bit. So we have the ability to, through our own strategies, maximize the amount of time we spend in eustress. We learned a little bit about dopamine in part 2. In fact, we learned a lot about dopamine and how it can help our process of goal-directed behavior and striving, how it is kind of the cornerstone of motivation, and that when we are working with dopamine, both mentally and physically, we're able to stabilize eustress. So not only are we able to get into that Goldilocks zone, but we're able to stay there if we're working alongside dopamine. We're noticing that there's a lot of different elements, pieces that have to come together. It feels like the stars have to align sometimes for us to really be into that optimal state. And that is exactly true. We're trying to bring all these pieces of the equation together. That's why it takes so many parts to explain all of these things. It's because, wow, you have to almost explain all of the steps leading up to it. And once we can bring them all together, we have an idea of what the perfect world, most optimal scenario looks like. This is what we've learned so far. What else do we need to add to this equation? It's not too much more. In fact, it's a pretty intuitive part that we haven't talked much about yet. And so you can see the tagline there is the serotonin dopamine balance. When folks think about serotonin, they often think about happiness. Why? Well, because many of our modern antidepressant medications are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also known as SSRIs. And so we think about a drug whose purpose is to keep serotonin in our system a little bit more, and it helps us to balance out our mood, feel a little bit more content and satisfied. And so when I'm thinking about serotonin, I'm thinking about satisfaction. And so far we've talked about cortisol and norepinephrine, right? That's the stress hormones we tend to think about and how to manage those. We talked about incorporating dopamine, right? Now we're going to talk about that last piece is serotonin, how that's going to fit into this puzzle. And so what we know about anti-fragile systems is that they become stronger when they're exposed to stress. And so that's a new word, anti-fragile. And it's actually a word that comes out of the business world. We're talking about anti-fragile systems and organizations, but it can also be applied to resilience, post-traumatic stress, a number of other things where we see after we've gone through something hard, we bounce back stronger. So one example of an antifragile systems is the muscles in your own body, right? We lift something heavy and it breaks down the muscles. And in the moment, we're fatigued, but if we have adequate rest and nutrition, those muscles bounce back, come back stronger, right? So it's an antifragile system. Stress, external stress, is something that ends up making it stronger. It turns out a lot of mental systems are that way too. And so in order to tap into this serotonin dopamine balance, we're thinking about how we can use integrated recovery, because you don't get stronger when you're lifting the weights. You actually get stronger in the interim between workout sessions when your body has a chance to rebuild back stronger in rest and relaxation. Turns out that the serotonin system, the one that keeps us satisfied and content, is the one which we want to try to leverage for rest and relaxation. We're going to see what that looks like. So here's this idea of antifragility, right? That something's fragile if it breaks easily under stress, right? Too much stress and it shatters like glass. Something can be robust whenever it resists breaking for a good amount of time before it eventually snaps, right? So iron, very robust. Takes a lot to try to bend it, and then eventually it does break. We can think of something as being resilient, right? That it can adapt for a good amount of time, and steel is a good thing to think about. That we went from steel or iron to steel because most of the big buildings that we have are made out of steel, that it can adapt to a number of different heat and pressure and environmental stressors, right? But given enough tension, enough pressure, stress over time, even things that are really resilient can break down, right? The opposite of all of those is kind of the antifragile system, where stressors actually make it stronger and it seems to rally when exposed to an optimal level of stress. Oh wow, this is the exact same slide as this. We're gonna keep it. Okay, moving on. What does that look like? So as we've noted, serotonin is associated with satisfaction and contentment. And so it aids and facilitates rest and recovery, because when we're resting and recovering, we kind of want to be okay with that. I think we've all had that experience of, trying to lay down to go to sleep or to take a nap or even just to relax for a weekend, and our mind is still buzzing with all the things on our to-do list. We're thinking about all the things that we need to do or get ahead of or that we're behind on, right? And so even though we're trying to relax, we're doing so in an unsatisfied state. We're still really restless. And so it gave some examples of what that balance of serotonin and dopamine might look like. And this is an exact science. Like, there's not a way right now that we can do a blood test or a saliva test or something and say, oh, well, your serotonin levels are here and your dopamine levels are here. That's not exactly how it works. But this is how we can kind of use this analogy to think about what's taking place in our brain based off of our psychology and our behavior. So high dopamine levels and low serotonin means I'm not very satisfied with what's going on. I'm motivated to change something. So motivation, desire, in the sense of restlessness, right? Whenever my dopamine is really high and I'm driven to achieve something, not achieving it kind of feels kind of icky. Like I have a lot of antsiness. I'm really restless to accomplish something. So, we might be high in dopamine, but we're trying to relax. Serotonin's low and we're still thinking about our to-do list. The opposite of that might be low dopamine, high serotonin, right? So we're actually not in a super motivated place. We're pretty chilled out, complacent, satisfactory, like everything is okay. Nothing really do I need to attend to right now. That my to-do list is taken care of, or if it's not taken care of, I'm not worried about it right now. I'm on vacation, right? So we could think of high serotonin, low dopamine as vacation mode. Low dopamine and low serotonin, that's the one where we're looking at depression and anxiety, right? When the things that lead to satisfaction or motivation aren't there anymore. And instead, usually something like norepinephrine is running the show. So our stress, fight, or flight response is running the show. And in that case, we might be predisposed to depression and anxiety, especially over long periods of time of low dopamine and low serotonin. That's why our SSRIs do a lot in terms of improving depressive and anxious symptoms for folks. And also behavioral activation, something like getting up and going, increases our dopamine, can also be a really good antidepressant behavior. Now, in some rare instances, we have high dopamine and high serotonin, and like just the right amount of norepinephrine and other arousal, attention hormones, neurotransmitters. And that's when we're thinking about we're in flow state, right? We're getting all of the positive things. We're really engaged, really in the moment and performing at a high level. And so we can see that there's a certain balance that needs to take place here. If you watched part 2, you would think that we want to be all dopamine all the time. But since this is an antifragile system, we're going to look for opportunities to rest and recover so we can benefit from the growth factor that stress provides for us. Okay. And so one way that we can balance serotonin and dopamine is through stress periodization. And so what periodization means is that it's just some intermittent stress through on a consistent basis. So I have a graph that's going to show what that could look like. But we want to designate some time for striving, for goal-directed behavior, and for intentional stress inoculation. It's just a bunch of big words that we want to pick a slot of time or maybe some chunks of time in each day that we're dedicated to working, to striving, to progress of some sort. And then we also want to designate some time for rest and relaxation and recovery, reflection, gratitude, those sorts of things. And so we can kind of turn on serotonin when we need to relax and recover. And then when we are ready to strive, we turn the serotonin off, turn the dopamine on, and we're off to the races with goal-directed behavior and striving towards a goal. Here's some examples of what might be a serotonin promoting activity. So reflective gratitude. Anytime that we stop and pause and think of all of the things that we do have, things that we are fortunate for, things that have worked out in our favor, it goes, oh, well, I have achieved a lot. I have accomplished a lot. The things that I have are enough, right? Those moments of reflective gratitude help to promote a feeling of satisfaction. And that is associated with dopamine. Unstructured play. So times that we're engaged in activities which don't necessarily have a certain outcome goal or even a process goal in some cases. Sometimes it's just doing things because we want to have fun. And that can be recreational sports, video games. You could watch some YouTube and Netflix as long as we don't over binge it. Unstructured times for enjoying things and entertainment. Meaningful social connection. It's just connecting with folks. Again, there's not an agenda around connecting with other individuals within our friend group or maybe making new friends on platforms. The idea is that some things don't necessarily need to have an end goal. And so meaningful social connection is one thing that promotes serotonin because having a community of folks makes us feel secure and safe. And then creating some psychological distance from stressors. That's why when folks go on vacation, they usually want to like up and go somewhere else because they can get away from the home, they can get away from the office, right? There's literal distance between them and the things that they find stressful in their day-to-day life. And so you can do that perfectly fine at home if you can find some ways to get some psychological distance from the things that want to put more things on your to-do list. Of course, all these things are promoted by nutrition and proper sleep. And so here is this graph that you might have seen if, I think it was it part 2? It was either part 1 or part 2 that I brought up this graph showing the natural cortisol levels. And by cortisol, I mean that stress hormone. Cortisol and melatonin work together to make our sleep-wake cycle, right? So when we get about 6 a.m., 7 a.m. when the sun starts rising, especially in those summer months when the days are longer, our cortisol levels naturally start to rise. And what that means for us is that we wake up, we're alert, awake, aroused. And as the sun continues to rise in the sky, our cortisol levels rise with it. As the sun peaks in the middle of the sky and then slowly starts to set, our cortisol levels also start to set. And so our natural stress cycles keep us most awake, alert, and aroused when the sun is up and moves with the sun. If I were going to show the graph of melatonin, That's actually almost an inverse of this. So when the sun begins to set, melatonin starts to pick up and helps to lull us into the state of sleep. Right. A lot of people use melatonin capsules as kind of a supplement if they're trying to get better sleep. And so if we wanted to work with this sleep wake cycle, then maybe what we would do is we would align our dopamine driven behaviors in this period of time where our cortisol is at its highest. Right. So I might wake up in the morning after a good night's rest and then set 4 or 5 hours aside for striving, learning, training, some sort of work, progress towards a goal or a project. Right. And then as our cortisol starts to taper off, we might consider, having more serotonin driven behaviors. And so I might use that time to connect with others. I might call home, right? I use that time to reflect on the things that are going well. I might use this time for play or some unstructured activities, which I find engaging, right? Hobbies, things like that. And so by kind of doing this day in and day out, again, we have this periodization where there's a good amount of time each day that is for striving, is for purposefully exposing ourselves to some kind of stress, hopefully eustress, the good kind of stress that helps to promote development of self and growth. And then also some time for rest, right? So that our antifragile systems can bounce back, come back stronger the next day because we've had time to reset. And that's exactly what this original graph was hoping that we would do, is that we would pick a time that we begin to wind down and physically repair. And this is kind of the dopamine area, and this is kind of the serotonin area. And we can do this day in and day out, structuring our schedule, our time, in ways that there's a balance between work and play. And so what does this look like in a perfect world? This is just an example. Imagine a world where we had designed an optimally stressful lifestyle, right? It was just stressful enough that it only ever promoted growth and development, that we were overcoming the stress that we were experiencing and becoming stronger and better people as a result. And so that would be 8 hours of eustress, some sort of learning, training, trying new things, testing things out, right? You might be working, you might be hands-on with a project of yours, right? Attentive, focused. 8 hours of rest, connecting with others, rest, recovery, relaxation, some form of play, right? And then 8 hours of sleep. That's a whole 24 hours. And you don't have to do it all at once. I'm not saying you have to get up and from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. you're just working straight through. But maybe you take 3 hours, right, of working and in our most awake times of day. And that's the first 3 hours of the day is for dopamine. Got it. And then maybe you take an hour or 2 hours of a lunch break, right? So that's a kind of rest and relaxation. And during the lunch break, make sure that all you're doing is mindfully eating, maybe connecting with some folks, relaxing, right? If you're still working on your to-do list or sending emails or those sorts of things during your lunch break, then we're not getting that optimal balance that we want. Imagine what it would be like to do 8 hours of eustress, 8 hours of rest a day. And that is a pretty good balance between work and play if we can space that out. That's going to change based off of your work schedule, based off of your life circumstances, based off of whether you have kids or not, based off of what kinds of jobs you're working, right? Or if you're working at all, right? It might be that it's really difficult to find opportunities for eustress when we're in a pandemic and what we used to do for work, we no longer have access to. So, of course, this is going to look different for different people, but this is just wrapping our mind around, if we could design for ourselves an optimally stressful lifestyle, what would that look like? And so I'm going to try and put myself right there. Okay. The idea is, and why it's taken so many parts and so much time to come to this conclusion, is that we would like for everything to be working together in concert. Cortisol, that's our awake, our alert, that's our attentive. Epinephrine, that's the maximum performance, that's the get up and go, right? In some cases, that's the fight or flight, but in a lot of other cases, it's just the forward momentum. Speaking of momentum, we're thinking about dopamine, which is motivation, direction, goal-directed behavior. And then times with serotonin, which is the satisfaction, contentment, you know, permission to relax and rest, to recover for the next day. All of these things working in concert kind of result in a state of general thriving, right? And that doesn't mean that they're all active at the same time, like in a flow state, but rather that there's some periodization. There's an ebb and flow, just in the same way that there's a sleep-wake cycle that we try to sync up with and that we very naturally fall into, that there's also kind of this work-play cycle that seems to be going on at the same time. This thriving, this state of optimal stress, it naturally and inevitably leads towards this kind of self-actualization as we progress up our hierarchy of needs. And so you might have seen this image of Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something like it. There's good data to show that this hierarchy might be structured differently for different people based off of different phases of your life. But ultimately, you likely have some things which you feel as though are prerequisites for others. So some of our psychological and safety needs might still be necessary for us to connect with friends. For example, if there's a pandemic, we might prioritize the safety of others and ourselves over connecting with people in real life, right? And have to create some or come to some creative solutions around how to meet our higher needs. But if we're in a state of thriving, we will almost naturally progress up this hierarchy towards what Maslow and others called self-actualization. Ultimately and inevitably, there's going to be things in life that suck, that happen, which are not, that don't promote thriving. In fact, they might even knock us into a state of surviving, right? For a lot of us, the pandemic might have been that thing, but many other financial stressors, interpersonal stressors, things that happen in your family or with your partner or your relationships, those sorts of things, those happen. But an optimally stressful lifestyle also allows us to recover from those setbacks. So even if it's a situation where it's 2 steps forwards and 1 step back, we're still making progress towards this state of self-actualization. All of this made possible through our keen sense of stress management. And so I'm hoping that part 1, part 2, and hopefully part 3 are helpful when you're thinking about organizing your own life and your relationship with your work and your relationship with your play, because if we can figure out a way, it takes some trial and error, like it takes some tinkering, but if we can figure out a way to access this optimally stressful lifestyle and to stay there, then it's one of those things that's only a matter of time, persistent effort, and consistency until we're kind of living a version of our best life that we're always kind of working towards. It's not something that I feel, and if you asked Abraham Maslow what he thought, or other really smart dead white guys like Carl Jung and them, they'd say that it's not something that you ever fully become and that you're just done becoming, but it's a kind of a process of becoming, which we are always engaged in, that there's always one step further in refining the self. And the state that we've kind of outlined, and we've brought in a bunch of biology and neurochemistry and evolutionary psychology and psychology and behavioralism. There's a lot of things we've touched on, at least in brief, to say how this is plausible and what a lifestyle oriented around this might look like. If you have any questions for me, because I know that sometimes I'm fast talking and I say words that have a lot of syllables that really don't mean a whole lot to people. They don't always mean a whole lot to me. Feel free to reach out to me and we can have a conversation about what this looks like. If you wanted to brainstorm what an optimally stressful lifestyle might look like for you, or what skills that you might want to incorporate into your current lifestyle in order to help to maximize the good stress, the eustress, feel free to reach out to me. These are conversations that I really enjoy having. It's been great bringing this 3-part series to you. We'll move on to other topics in fitness psychology. Let me know what you think. If you want to be a part of making these productions more accessible and higher quality than just me talking to my camera with a PowerPoint presentation, reach out to me. I would love to brainstorm how to make this better in the future. Right now, it's just about putting things out into the world and seeing what sticks. So they're not just gathering dust in my brain. But at some point, I would like to make this a little bit more palatable, that more people would be interested in looking through it, and that might mean increasing the production value a little bit. But in the meantime, I will see you next time, next week, next Friday, hopefully, as we continue to release one fitness psychology oriented video per week, free, online, ad free, for as long as I can help it. Okay, thank you.